When Leo Strauss spoke of Machiavelli as the founding father of the modern world, he implied that we are today all Machiavellian by default. We are not Machiavellian by nature, we're not born Machiavellian, but we are raised as Machiavellians in a Machiavellian world, a world defined by what Machiavelli himself called new orders, new ways, new way of life, a life ordered in a new way. Was Machiavelli not traditionally seen as evil? Yes, there is something to it, says Leo Strauss. But at the same time, when we look at Machiavelli as evil, we miss a crucial point, namely, our own indebtedness to Machiavelli. Machiavelli was teaching us to do evil, was he not? Not quite. Machiavelli told us that, well, anything is legitimate as long as it serves the end that you set for yourself. Not quite. Machiavelli is telling us that a good end justifies the means. What does he mean by a good end? Well, an ideal. Machiavelli is the founding father of modern idealism. This is hard to swallow for us. All of our cherished ideals, the most beautiful ideals that we can have, not least of them God conceived as ideal, the kingdom of ends that we can build, anything we can come up with, indeed, all of the great terms of our classical tradition, now reformatted, repackaged in terms of ideals. Is this not what had been the case from the beginning of time? What happened? How is it that have we been tricked into something and we don't realize it? How would we realize it when our schools raise us as Machiavellian, if only in the act of setting up a Machiavellian straw man? So we can laugh at Machiavelli, we could turn him into even a devil in the very act of following in his footsteps, of living out his blueprint. So, what did Machiavelli say? What is it that we can do to snap out of it? How can we figure out if we're really Machiavellian or just, this guy on the internet is merely saying this? Leo Strauss merely implied this. If we do not understand what we're indebted to thoroughly at the root, how can we be sure that we are free from ties to that source? Well, let us consider what Machiavelli is doing. Machiavelli, in Strauss's terms, is reducing philosophy to ideology. What does that mean? It means that the philosophical life had traditionally been geared toward the otherworldly. In what respect? The objects of pure contemplation. Natural reason had been seen as the vehicle to the otherworldly. Natural reason. What does this tell us? It tells us that there is a journey to the true object of human desire or love. This journey was called reason, natural reason. Now, why in the world would we be treading that path? Well, in the classical, both ancient and medieval world, this was almost self-evident. The senses were not trustworthy. Our feelings were certainly not trustworthy. They could become partially trustworthy in the context of this path, a path of purgation, a path of reflection, where we bring our own certainties into question, not for the sake of establishing ourselves as most certain about ourselves, but rather in order to expose ourselves to what is the beyond. Now, this would mean that we would in principle have access to an understanding of ultimate ends, an understanding that could be translated for everyone. In linguistic terms, we could speak about ultimate ends. Now, what happened was that people started fighting over these ultimate ends, or rather formulations about the ultimate ends, because people had various degrees of understanding. And so, the modern turn, which is most evident in the figure of Machiavelli, pivotal figure for us, involves a shift. We no longer speak about things as they are. We speak about concepts about things. We don't talk about justice. We talk about, well, the idea in the sense of the concept of justice, not justice itself. And the reason is that you want to avoid fighting over something that you're speaking about as if it were the thing itself. You don't want to make a mistake and say, well, look, I'm talking about real justice, whereas in fact I'm speaking about my own concept, my own construal of justice. So this is pretty insightful as a point, one might say. Isn't this important to do? We should distinguish our concept of justice from justice itself. Well, the ancients didn't do that. Well, of course they did, except that they didn't do it precisely that way. In other words, they drew a distinction between opinions and the thing itself, which was called the idea in Platonic terms. The true form of things were the things themselves, right? Was the thing itself. So the form of justice, the idea of God, is God himself. But that idea, that form, is not a concept in my mind. So there is no such divide as we have in the modern world between the idea of God and God. Right? Now, say, well, what about the opinions and the thing itself? Isn't it now equivalent to saying that there is a distinction between the concept of God and God himself? No. The concept of God is a kind of synthesis of God himself, in traditional terms, and the opinion of God. The opinion that people might have of God. The concept is supposed to, in the modern context, is supposed to have a universal public valence, character. So we can all speak about this concept of God. What Machiavelli is doing here, if only very slightly, cunningly, in a very roundabout way, what he is doing is introducing us to a world in which we're no longer addressing things themselves. All ends that we speak about are ends insofar as we conceive them. Sometimes this is called a subjectivist turn. At any rate, what we have with Machiavelli is the turn to the past, to the ancient past, the pre-Christian past, because he didn't want to get into trouble, and because he wanted to establish new foundations for the reading of Christianity. So he turns to ancient Roman history, Titus Livius. And he says, well, he was not altogether right, so he rereads the source. For the sake of rereading the pagan, Roman, pre-Christian history, the stories, in other words, life in the pagan world. And he says, you know what? The ancients had an idea that, in other words, they understood that religion is there to manipulate people, to have them behave well. But they didn't quite understand that philosophers could use religion. That we could use religion scientifically. And this was the way Machiavelli sees to establish a world of, modern idealism, in a world in which we're no longer dealing with things themselves or the pretense of things themselves, but with concepts. So, what happens when philosophy uses religion? Now, especially when it comes to Christianity, what happens is that the whole language of the tradition, Platonic language, the Platonic terms, is reconceived. It is now to serve a new philosopher's aim. The religion is now useful. We have these concepts which are a kind of synthesis of opinions and things themselves, as, at any rate, as they were, insofar as they were referred to, spoken of by the Christian theological tradition, which of course inherited the Platonic language, discourse. So, what we have now is a new synthesis. Let us think about this a little bit. What is involved here? We no longer have the slaves and the masters. Machiavelli is a great liberator. He says no more slaves who are dealing with opinions, mere appearances, and then these masters who are supposedly dealing with the real thing. Right? They're the ones who have access to God. We only have the pictures of God. The caste of priests, bad. Right? Now, whether or not this was a caricature of what was happening, to what extent Machiavelli was right in his assessment of his diagnosis of the situation, we can bracket now. What is important to recognize here is what he is up to. Machiavelli is saying, in order to overcome these problems that we had in the past, most notably the tension between slaves and master, in order to establish justice, a good order. Who doesn't want a good order in this world? Well, what do? We can do something. It is not enough to pray for the other world. Sure, we'll get the other world. But what about now? What do we do now, since we don't have the other world yet? This makes sense. So what do? We need a strategy. We need to bridge the gap between the slave and the master, between opinions, mere subjective opinions, and, well, supposedly the things themselves. All right. And we do this through a reformulation, a reconceptualizing of Christian theological discourse, which already had its very sophisticated terminology, its universals, its transcendental terms and concepts. But again, in a classical context. Now what we do is we take these concepts. These concepts, unlike the old slavish opinions or the priestly great universals that are heavenly, they can be applied. They can be used to establish peace on earth, justice on earth, to have new constitutions for our countries. Now, this is fascinating. Who wouldn't want to do something like that? Machiavelli is a man of peace. He says, well, when you need to do war, you do war. Right? But the point is that you want to establish an order which is fair on earth. What about the ancients? Wait a second now. Let's see. I mean, did the ancients not care about the world? Yes, but they did not approach life, they did not live that way. They had not invented yet these abstract concepts, almost mathematically symbolic concepts that could be used to build a new world. Why not? Because they were very suspicious of any attempt to establish a new world. Because they had an understanding of the human condition, of human nature, given which understanding they saw that, nothing good is going to come out of it, ultimately. That the establishment of concepts in the modern context involves alienation from the real condition of man. It involves further alienation from the fundamental problems of life, and so from the problem of the divine, of the transcendent. What you have here is an attempt, poorly masked perhaps, veiled, to establish a Tower of Babel. What about Machiavelli here? Isn't he a bad guy? He wants all good things for us. Except that what is good is not defined by God or nature. It is defined with the help of nature and God. But we define it. We define what is right and wrong, what is good and evil, with the help of God and nature. Now, nature is fuel, is there, it's like the past. He goes to the past and he takes what he needs, what he wants, dumps the rest, manipulates, twists, and he uses it to establish our new world, to help us establish it at any rate. What about God? Well, God is this greater power. Who will deny that there is such a thing as a greater power? Yes, we should stop fighting over these definitions of God. It's just a greater power, not a greater intelligence. If it is a greater intelligence, that's just, metaphorically speaking, a greater power. That's how Machiavellian man conceives of the divine, as a greater power. Why power? Baruch Spinoza, great philosopher of the modern world, looked up to Machiavelli as a wise man. He called him on more than one occasion sapiens. Sapiens. And for Spinoza, sapiens, to be wise, is a big thing. That's the apex of human development, when you're wise. It is not enough to know formally God. The essence of man we can know towards the beginning of our investigations with Spinoza. the essence of God, of God's mind. We can figure that out geometrically. Easy stuff. Then we move on, because what really counts is what God is ultimately, namely existence itself. And so the knowledge of existence, of the unfolding, of becoming, this in itself, this is the greatest, the peak, the greatest knowledge. The knowledge of becoming. And Machiavelli was wise for Spinoza because he had understanding. He had knowledge of the greater power. The power of existence, what would later be called the power that is involved in the will to power. So with Nietzsche, we have the same story. This greater power is beyond our own power, but we can access it. How? Well, how do we understand this power? We understand it as we work things out. First of all, we see that the old classical situation, Platonism, was all dubious, was all flaky, was all unscientific. Now, we have a technical purgation of reason. With Kant, a critique of pure reason. Pure reason has only concepts, not things themselves. Now, pure reason is to be understood in the light of an instrumentalist reason, a practical reason, which is a technical Machiavellian reason. This is the reason that helps us apply the concepts, right, to establish a better world, a kingdom of ends. This practical reason, or this technical reason, or this instrumental reason, is what we learn in schools today. This is all schools are about. They're teaching us the instruments. They're empowering us with these instruments. They will help us build this new world. What's wrong with this? One might say. Who would want to go fighting for God and definitions of God? Well, the thing is that people fight it anyway. All you need to do is go to Maoist China or Stalin's Russia and so forth and see, or Robespierre, France's Robespierre. You'll see that you don't need a Christian God. You don't need Christianity to fight most viciously and torture and murder millions of people. Pol Pot, you name it. And these are just some of the glaring names. You can go all over the place in the world. Now, what happens here is that you attempt to improve the human situation. Can the human situation be improved? Well, locally for the ancients, yes. But on one condition, that you open up to divine intelligence and that you're in harmony with that divine intelligence, and so that ultimately it is the light that shines from the divine that saves you. You're not calculating your private interest or public interest given certain concepts. You're not trying to establish solutions. Improvement on a local basis means living in further openness to the otherworldly, to the divine, to divine intelligence. Divine intelligence that is at work in everything, in mysterious ways. This is divine providence. So, the ancients did not try to establish a better world. Oh, boy, that sounds lousy. I mean, you could try, but on what condition? This is the problem here. On what condition? And with Machiavelli, the condition is further and further and further alienation from things themselves. This is where you end up with our present situation, where we have technocracy, a world where everything is a machine, everything is mechanically structured, and then we hide, we escape, we seek escape in our feelings. And at this point, we're being flattered into believing that our feelings will disclose for us a vision of God. That is completely preposterous for the classics. Perfect example is the recycling of the term heart. God is in your heart. Well, today we conceive that proposition in terms of God is in our feelings. Our feelings express God. We listen to our feelings and we know God. That is not at all what the classics meant. The heart was a soul. The soul was originally something impregnating darkness, as it were. So it is running through our veins. And so that's what it is. God is what gives us life. It's a principle of life. In this case, God is not so much a power, although there is power, which is to say a capacity, as an intelligence. The classical terms for God would be nolle, velle, and posse in Latin, which is to say knowledge, will, volition, and capacity. The capacity that is to be brought back to the knowledge, in other words, into mind, through the velle, which is a kind of strength of mind which stretches out into the dark and embraces, brings things within itself, right? That gathers. What about our understanding of God? The classics, no doubt, have this problem. Opinions versus things themselves. The vast majority of people deal with opinions. And then there are those who deal with things themselves beyond the realm of opinions. And those would be traditionally the philosophers in the Middle Ages, very often called the mystics. Now, when you have the category of the theologians who are trying to keep these two poles, right, distinct, they're mediating the two poles, you start having the buildup of an infrastructure of terms. Right? This is the issue that we have with the Middle Ages. You have a lot of terminology and phrases, formulas that sometimes become manipulated by bad people. And so at this point, Machiavelli comes in and he says, let the good people manipulate these concepts. Well, the good people, for him, are Epicurean philosophers who do not see the divine in terms of intelligence, but in terms of sheer power, the greater power. And so we have Machiavelli using this whole apparatus of concepts that was already pretty much established in the Middle Ages, not to keep the slave and the master distinct, but to bridge the two, to bring them together. And we would say scientifically today. In other words, these concepts, as I pointed out just a minute ago, these concepts are used to establish a new world order. New ways, he says, new orders. New configurations of life, a redirecting of life, right? Life is turned. There is a Copernican revolution. There is a Kantian revolution. All of this follows from this early project, this early blueprint, this Machiavellian blueprint. In what way are we Machiavellian today? How do we know that we're Machiavellian? Well, whenever we speak about the concept of something as if it were a synthesis of an opinion and the thing itself, and a concept that can leave the thing itself on the side, we don't have to talk about the thing itself, we are Machiavellian. Whenever we assume that it is in the vehicle of feelings that we find closer link to God, closer union, or more profound, truer relationship with God through our feelings, there we are Machiavellian. Wherever we dream about establishing or promoting or helping bring about a better world, we are Machiavellian. Wherever we think that it is worthwhile fighting for our ideals, never mind what we really believe in, then we are Machiavellian. Was Machiavelli evil? Are we being raised to be evil without being aware of it? Machiavelli understood one thing, that if you are evil, if you're treading in evil, don't show it off. don't make it evident. You have to smile and pretend to be good. Ultimately, to be good is to pretend to be good. And there's no such thing as just evil. Evil is just being stupid and to showing that you're just pretending. We just have to pretend and pretend that we don't know that we're pretending until we kind of pretend to believe that we are not pretending. And so we end up in a world of pretense, where everything is a pretense, and everybody is, fooling everybody else, or pretending to fool everybody else. And so, the emperor is naked. Yeah, that's fine, as long as everybody has interest in this game. But as soon as you're not receiving your paycheck from the institution that works for this logic of pretension, you become dangerous to the system. Now, the system likes you to talk, because talk is cash. Talk is information that can be manipulated for audience, for establishing, again, this new world. What is this new world ultimately about? It's a world in which there's no more slave and master. There's only a machine, and everybody else, everybody is on the same plane. Everybody's equal. There is one thing that is more equal than everything else, which is the machine. So, the machine, its logic, its way of processing life, right? All of this is dominating. Now, what happens to us? We can still dream about God. We can still dream about anything. We have Disneyland. We can dream about having the Eiffel Tower. It's in Disneyland. We don't need the real thing. We have screens. We can see life on a screen. We don't need real life. We do not need a relationship with the other sex. We can see it on the screen. Everything is virtual. Everything is alienation. And the more alienated, the more mediated, the better, because it avoids danger, confrontation. Right? Let's have children, if we want to have children, in vitro, right? Through artificial insemination. It spares us the trouble. Right? Now, for the ancients, let us just point this out now. For the ancients, trouble was not a good in itself, but trouble reminded you of your destiny. We are not born to stay here. We're born to bear witness. In everything we do, we are to reflect our final destination. We are never to be distracted from that destination. And this is what makes us strong. This is what makes us alive. This is what makes us honest. No sooner have we abandoned this pursuit of things themselves and the virtue of speaking truthfully, of bespeaking our common end, then our safety, our newly gained safety, turns into a prison. We're now building a world that is more and more of a prison. where we have to just pretend to be free, pretend that we're all fine, that we're doing better. And yes, there are glitches, but we can work it out if we find another technician with another strategy, with another patch for our software. And we won't have the glitches. We'll get rid of all of those glitches. Once we get rid of all of those glitches, everything will be fine. We'll have formulas, we'll have codes, we'll have algorithms. Everything will be fine. And we'll speak in the language of the machine. And we will become machines, or at the very least, pretend to be machines. Indeed, we're raised to see ourselves as machines. Schools do their best to convince kids that we're all imperfect machines to be perfected by the great logic of the modern world. All by collaborating, by entering into networks of fake friendships, of opportunists who smile to each other for the sake of backstabbing each other, perhaps. At any rate, no, you don't want to say that, so helping each other step over each other. That's how we're raised. We are Machiavellian by default. If you still don't see this, God bless you.